Hi, my name is Lorraine Jacobs, and I'm here welcoming you because Mark Miller is away. He's doing a ski race in a colder place, but I'm here, so I'm glad. Welcome to the Sunday Morning Forum at First Unitarian Society in Milwaukee. We're thankful always for George Bledsoe at the computers, the technology. Without George, it would be a very different forum experience for everyone. I'm just saying, he's great. So, and Sherry. Before we begin today, I'd like to bring your attention to next Sunday, and the topic will be Our Future Milwaukee, the Milwaukee Climate and Equity Plan. So we're going to move to that subject next Sunday. But today we have a speaker who will be introduced by our host today who's coming over, and that's Barbara Cullingham. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm happy to introduce Polly Ellingson. She practiced exclusively in the area of employment-based immigration law from 2002 until her retirement last year from Greca Law Group. In that capacity, she provided immigration advice and counsel to physicians and other healthcare professionals and scientists, as well as business clients, assisting them and their families with obtaining temporary employment status and permanent residence and other immigration benefits. Ms. Ellingson also has many years of experience working in the education and healthcare sectors, including serving as the first general counsel of the Medical College of Wisconsin and director of hospitals legal affairs of the University of Washington Hospitals. She's also a past president of the Washington State Society of Hospital Attorneys and a former elected commissioner of King County, Washington, Public Hospital District Number 2. And here we have Polly Ellingson.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to give you some information about immigration laws and rules. This is somewhat of a homecoming for me. I grew up in Milwaukee. My family and I attended this church when I was a child in the 1950s. And after spending 20 years in the Pacific Northwest, I came back here and I'm now a member of UUCW West in Brookfield. So, certainly. Oops, is this? Okay. All right, George, may we have next slide, please? So I'd like to provide everyone with an overview of key facts regarding the current immigration climate, debunk some myths regarding immigration and immigrants, and answer any questions you might have. So I was interested to learn when I first started practicing immigration law that there were no immigration laws in the US prior to 1921. So in 1921, the Emergency Quota Act, which was also known as the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921, was passed. And that act restricted immigration into the US and imposed a quota that limited the number of immigrants who would be admitted from any country annually to 3% of the numbers of the residents from that same country who lived in the United States at that time. And that was based on the US Census of 1910. Taking native-born residents into account, this calculation included a total of about 358,000 new immigrants which would be allowed annually. And of that number, just over half was allocated for Northern and Western Europeans, and the remainder for Eastern and Southern Europeans, which was a 75% reduction from prior years. In 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act abolished national origin quotas and gave preference to skilled workers and professionals. And we'll talk a little later on about what the current situation is with skilled workers and professionals. And the last major revision of immigration law came in 1986. And if you'll give us the next slide, please. So the US continues to be a country of immigrants where people come to join family members already here. This trend is really reflective of how our country came to be and has always been a major goal of immigration policy from its inception. As according to the National Immigration Forum, family visas account for about 65% of legal immigration. Coupled with escaping persecution, employment opportunities are secondary reasons. The overwhelming number of people don't come here for just employment, usually because they can't get a visa. Surprisingly, those who applied in 1988 aren't Mexican, they're Filipino. An adult Filipino whose adult US citizen sibling applied for them at any time after January 1, 1988, still does not have a green card. A green card is a lawful permanent resident status. So most Mexicans and Filipinos have to wait at least 15 years, while people from other parts of the world wait between 5 and 10 years to become lawful permanent residents. So next slide, please. Sorry about that. So what are some of the common myths relating to immigration? The first one, that immigrants don't pay taxes. All immigrants pay taxes, whether income, property, sales, or other. As far as income tax payments go, sources vary in their accounts, but a range of studies find that immigrants pay between $90 and $140 billion a year in federal, state, and local taxes. Even undocumented immigrants pay income taxes, as evidenced by the Social Security Administration suspense file. This file, a place where money goes when received by the Social Security Administration without a matching Social Security number, has become a hotbed for discussion, as it continues to grow by roughly $6 billion a year. In fact, as of 2005, the total was up to $519 billion and was comprised of nearly 250 million records. The second one up there, that immigrants come to the US to take welfare and use public assistance. Illegal immigrants, or what we call undocumented aliens, are not eligible for public assistance or welfare ever. Furthermore, even legal permanent residents are severely limited when it comes to the benefits that they can receive. They must pay into Social Security and Medicare systems for about 10 years before they are eligible to receive retirement benefits. They're not eligible for receiving care at most free clinics, as proof of income or lack thereof is needed to keep these programs funded. There are a few exceptions, but these cases still require documentation and processing through the immigration system. For instance, there's a program called, there's a statute called Violence Against Women Act, and under that act, the spouse or child of a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident, or the parent of a US citizen who is battered or subject to extreme cruelty, may file a self-petition independently of the abusive US citizen or lawful permanent resident, spouse, or parent. But that would be an exception. The third one, terrorism will not be defeated through immigration restrictions. No security expert since 9/11 has said that restrictive immigration measures would have prevented the terrorist attacks. Instead, they all say that the key is to have good use of solid intelligence. Most of the 9/11 hijackers were here on legal visas. Database conversions, 10 fingerprint advancements, and face scans have resulted in better passport security, which is a good thing for our country. However, under the guise of making our country safer, which no one really argues about as an issue of importance, approvals of legitimate and necessary petitions are more restrictive. The fourth one up there, drug smuggling. Another myth is that drug smuggling is largely done by illegal aliens or undocumented aliens. The fact is that undocumented immigrants are not criminals by and large. You should know that entering the US without proper authorization or overstaying a visa and its original purpose are not considered criminal offenses. in the eyes of the law. Undocumented folks are generally hardworking community members whose kids go to school, who are heavily involved in church and community groups, and who contribute to society and the economy. According to the National Immigration Forum in 2023, drug seizures at the US-Mexico border by pounds seized are trending down, but it's important to acknowledge that there's an increase in illicit fentanyl smuggling into the US. The challenge, however, is not purely an immigration issue. Illicit fentanyl is being smuggled predominantly by US citizens and through ports of entry. Evidence indicates that illicit fentanyl is primarily brought to the US by American citizens and usually through legal points of entry. The calculation is simple. Illicit drug smuggling organizations are likely to prefer US citizens as smugglers because they are less likely to raise alarms or undergo additional vetting when re-entering the US through a port of entry, a legal port of entry. A 2007 study by the University of California, Irvine found that among men ages 18 through 39 who comprise the majority of the US prison population, the incarceration rate for US-born citizens was 3.5%, 5 times higher than the rate for immigrants in 2000. A 2023 study done by a Stanford economist found that first-generation immigrants have not been more likely to be imprisoned than people born in the US since 1880. Today, immigrants are 30% less likely to be incarcerated than US-born individuals who are white, that study says. The fifth one up there, undocumented immigrants are often criminals or more likely to commit crimes than US citizens. I kind of dealt with that. Illegals, quote unquote, and we prefer to refer to them as undocumented aliens, take US jobs. Studies show that undocumented immigration either has no effect on US-born workers or actually increases the labor market opportunities by boosting the industries that create new jobs. According to the Brookings Institution, the largest wave of immigration in the US since the early 1900s coincided with our lowest national unemployment rate and fastest economic growth. Immigrant entrepreneurs create jobs for the US and foreign workers, and foreign-born students allow many US graduate school programs to keep their doors open. Just think about Silicon Valley. Companies begun by Chinese and Indian immigrants generated more than $19.5 billion in sales and nearly 73,000 jobs in 2000 alone. We'll take a look at this a little later in the presentation. And could we have next slide, please? According to the Center for Migration Studies in 2019, 62% of undocumented immigrants enter the country legally and then overstay their visas. A report released in March 2024 by the Center of Migration Studies of New York finds that from 2016 to 2017, people who overstayed their visas accounted for 62% of the newly undocumented, while 38% had crossed a border illegally. According to the executive director for the Center for Immigration Studies, quote, "It's clear from our research that persons who overstay their visas add to the US undocumented population at a higher rate than border crossers. This is not a blip, but a trend which has become the norm. As these numbers indicate, construction of hundreds of more miles of border wall would not address the challenge of irregular migration into our country, far from it," unquote. So this is quite a stark difference from the picture that you hear in the news media. And most people believe that weak US border enforcement had led to high undocumented immigration, and that's not necessarily the case. US Customs and Border Protection employed nearly 26,000 officers in 2022, and the Border Patrol also toughened its enforcement strategy, heavily fortifying typical urban entry points and pushing migrants into dangerous desert areas in hopes of deterring crossings. Instead, the undocumented immigration population doubled in that time frame to 8 million, despite the legalization of nearly 3 million immigrants after the enactment of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. There are insufficient legal avenues for immigrants to enter the US compared with the number of jobs available to them. So that's part of the problem that exists right now. In 2009, the Cato Institute conducted a study called Restriction or Legalization, Measuring the Economic Benefits of Immigration Reform. That study found that compared to either border or interior enforcement, a policy of legalization would raise the incomes of US workers and their families. A program to grant legal status to unauthorized workers already in the US, combined with new channels for the arrival of immigrant workers, created more job openings for American workers in higher skilled occupations. The net result would be economic gains of roughly 180 billion over 10 years. An enforcement-only approach would shrink the overall economy, reducing opportunities for higher skilled American workers. The net result would be economic losses of roughly $80 billion over 10 years. The Cato Institute's simulations show that the difference between tighter border enforcement and legalization policies considered and tested has an impact of about $260 billion over 10 years on US households. In 2023, the Cato Institute answered that question for us. And it's important for us as community members and business people to understand the impact. If you take two things away from this study, it should be this. If the US takes an enforcement-only approach to immigration law, it would result in economic losses of $80 billion over 10 years. However, if the US takes an approach that grants legal status to undocumented workers and creates more channels for future plans, it would result in economic gains of 180 billion over 10 years. So the Cato report makes the essential point that reforming our broken immigration system by bringing our unauthorized workers into our tax system and onto the right side of the law will help our economy. Continuing enforcement-only policies not only neglects the broken system, but will actually cost our economy billions of dollars over the next decade. Next slide, please. So what do we know about immigrants in Wisconsin? According to the American Immigration Council, Wisconsin has a small but growing community of immigrants, many of whom emigrated from Mexico. Wisconsin has, immigrants are an integral part of Wisconsin's diverse and thriving communities and make extensive contributions that benefit all of us. 5% of Wisconsin residents are immigrants, while another 5% of residents are native-born US citizens with at least one immigrant parent. Nearly half of all immigrants in Wisconsin are naturalized US citizens. Immigrant workers comprise 6% of the labor force in 2018, with only 2% being undocumented. Immigrants in Wisconsin have contributed billions of dollars in taxes. Immigrant-led households in the state paid $1.7 billion in federal taxes and $968 million in state and local taxes in 2018. Undocumented immigrants paid an estimated $156.9 million in federal taxes and $101 million in state and local taxes in 2018. In 2022, the foreign-born accounted for 18.1% of the US civilian labor force. That would include both documented and undocumented foreign nationals, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So next slide, please. I'm sure you're aware of the attention that immigration has received in the presidential campaign and will continue to receive during President-elect Trump's administration. Title 42 of the US Code is currently in place and was put in place during COVID-19. Title 42 has been used to implement measures such as expelling individuals at the border without the standard immigration process, citing public health concerns. Prior to Title 42, Title 8 was in place. During that time, people were allowed to come to the border, and asylees were granted a hearing and had an actual process, an expedited removal process, put into place. In case you don't know, asylees are foreign nationals who have a credible fear of danger or persecution in their country of origin. However, Title 42 provides that people can be denied entry to prevent the spread of disease rather than hearing their claims of credible fear. Immigration was one of the hottest button issues in the presidential campaign, and most respondents said they thought a border wall along the southern US border should continue to be built. 54% said it should continue, including 85% of Republicans and almost 6 in 10 of independents. 3/4 of Democrats said it should not continue to be built. There was again a big gender split in the suburbs on the question, with 2/3 of men saying that we should continue building the wall, while just half of women in those areas saying the same thing. There are also double-digit gaps between those with and without college degrees, which is probably no surprise, especially among whites, with those not holding college degrees more likely to want the wall built. Arguments about a deportation-only policy and building the wall often are touted as the only type of policy that will ultimately fix our immigration problems. However, deporting 10+ million undocumented immigrants from the US is not feasibly possible. And in addition to damaging families and industries, a deportation-only policy does not address the fundamental dysfunction of our immigration system. A 2019 study by the Center for Immigration Studies, a group that supports limits on immigration, found that excluding immigrants from the census count for purposes of drawing congressional districts would take away seats from some states while giving more to others. Critics said the administration's efforts first to include a citizenship question, we're talking about the prior Trump administration, and now to disregard undocumented immigrants from apportionment would lead to undercounts of even legal non-citizens and minority residents, resulting in less representation and federal funding in areas where they live, which tend to vote Democratic. The New York Times in 2019 said that the Trump administration had argued that including the citizenship question on census forms was an important part of its effort to protect the voting rights of the nation's minority residents. But opponents said that including the question would deter many immigrants and their families, both legal and undocumented, from participating in the census, which would have the effect of shifting political power among the states and between the major political parties. Then President Donald Trump said in 2018 he would soon issue an executive order that would prevent US-born children of undocumented immigrants from automatically obtaining US citizenship. Mr. Trump has recently said that birthright citizenship should be eliminated. However, this would require amending the US Constitution. Next slide, please. Here are some statistics regarding public opinion on immigration issues. About 9 in 10 Republicans and Republican-leaning independents call increasing security along the US-Mexico border an important goal, including 72% saying it should be a very important goal. While a majority of Democrats and Democratic leaners, 59%, say border security should be at least somewhat important, just 22% consider this as very important, 50 percentage points less than the share of Republicans who say this. About 8 in 10 Republicans say increasing deportation of immigrants currently in the country illegally is important, while nearly half calling it very important. By comparison, 39% of Democrats view increasing deportations as very or somewhat important, including just 12% of who see it as very important. Democrats are more likely than Republicans, 80% versus 37%, to say that establishing a way for most immigrants currently in the country illegally to stay legally is an important goal for the nation's immigration system. About 4 in 10 Democrats view this as a very important goal, compared with 10% of Republicans. Majorities in both parties say that taking in refugees from countries where people are fleeing war, such as Ukraine, is an important goal. Nonetheless, more Democrats than Republicans view it as important, 85% versus 58%, and about 4 in 10 Democrats say taking in refugees is very important, while just 13% of Republicans say the same. Conservative Republicans are most likely to express strong support for more restrictive immigration goals, such as increased border security and increased deportations, even when compared with others in their party. Liberal Democrats, by contrast, are the least supportive of these restrictive goals, while being the most supportive of establishing a path to legalization for undocumented immigrants in the country. Next slide, please. Are we having a technical problem? There we go. Thank you, George. A common comment when discussing immigration is, well, why don't they just come here legally? Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Let me just go through a few of the barriers facing people who would like to take the steps to US citizenship. We'll use an individual from Mexico as an example. This is pretty much the intake questionnaire that we use, the Greca firm uses for potential clients who stop by our office to see if there's any way that we can help them. It's sort of like one of those choose your own adventure books. If they answer yes to our questions, there may be some way to acquire legal status in the US at some point, and they can continue their adventure. If they say no, it's pretty much the end of the story under our current system. There are no legal options available. First, we explore what potential paths to lawful immigration permanent residence, such as a green card holder, and eventual citizenship might be available. We ask if they have any close relatives who are lawful permanent residents or citizens. If so, that person may be able to apply for a green card on their behalf through family-based immigration system. While it's true that the vast majority of immigrants, legal or illegal, enter the country at least partially to join another family member, many of those family members may be undocumented as well, or may just be not in one of those qualifying relationships. The family relationships are listed up there. So we ask if they work in a specialty occupation or have a bachelor's degree or anything like that. Most are unskilled workers, like workers who work for dairy farmers, milking cows. There are very limited visas for unskilled workers, and those are only for temporary workers in the H-2B program. So an employer, such as a farmer, may be able to get a number of foreign nationals to come in to help harvest crops, for instance, but that doesn't allow them to stay. It's just a very limited period of time that they would be approved to be here and to work. And H-2B is also for temporary employment. For instance, tourist areas and hotels may have a need for workers who would only be in the US for part of the year. So that doesn't really help people who are unskilled, who are capable of working, and the economy needs them, but there's no way to get them here legally. Let's say we do make it past the first barrier and have a potential family member to serve as a petitioner. Then they start the process and fill out the first paperwork. Now, if you're an immediate relative of a US citizen, you're lucky. A green card or lawful permanent resident status is immediately available, meaning you only have to wait for the government to process your paperwork, conduct an interview, and adjudicate your application. Many of these people don't even have to leave the country to receive their green cards, and the process often takes less than 2 years. And green cards are called that because the cards used to be green, and they're green again. But if you qualify for a green card under the preference system, which is listed up there, that's an entirely different story, especially for Mexicans. This is because the per-country limitations on the number of green cards that are available to beneficiaries for each country across the globe each year. You can't apply for a green card unless your petition is current, meaning that the government is processing applications in your category from your country that were filed on or after the day you filed your petition. For Mexicans, many of the categories are now processing petitions that were filed between 1998 and 2003. That's at least 20 to 25 years ago. It's important to note that if these people who are in the US standing in line waiting for their petition to become current, but they have no legal status while they're in this limbo. Although they're trying to follow all the proper procedures, they cannot work legally, receive a driver's license, or any public benefits. They are deportable at any time. Only those people who are finally, or once these people are finally eligible to complete the process of applying for the green card, they're often in a situation that requires them to travel to the US consulate in Ciudad Juarez in an attempt to receive their visa or green card. That's because if they've been living in the US, they have likely been here illegally for 20 plus years and have acquired a bar from being admitted to the US. While some bars cannot be overcome, especially for criminal reasons or multiple deportations, others can be waived if extreme hardship to the US citizen or lawful permanent resident can be proven. This is a very high standard and is getting more difficult. So after waiting 20 to 25 years, Mexicans often have to decide if it's worth the risk to leave the US and go to the very dangerous Ciudad Juarez for these interviews for the waiver and final interview for the green card. On the upside, they could get the green card and live happily ever after with their families. But on the other hand, they can just as easily be denied and face long-term separation from their families. So assuming everything goes well and the individual receives their green card, if they manage to stay out of trouble for 5 years or 3 years, if married to a US citizen, they can apply for citizenship, where they have to pass a pretty tough civics test that not all of us US citizens could pass off the top of our heads. And I want to touch on a bit on another barrier, the price of gaining legality. Mind you, applicants are generally happy to pay these fees and fines, but they are substantial for anyone. Generally, we're looking at about $3,000 in fees per person. That doesn't include lawyers' fees, travel cost, or lost income when people have to travel back to Mexico to get their green card. That's a lot of money for anyone to pay, especially someone who doesn't make much money. And this often delays the legalization process. I want to mention an individual. I've talked about the long waits for people who are here illegally from Mexico, which could be 20 to 25 years. My daughter-in-law has a good friend that she worked with who is a DACA recipient. And this is someone who was brought here as a child by their non-immigrant parents. So they were born abroad, and in this particular case, this young woman was born in Mexico. She is bilingual. She's in her 20s now. She has a 2-year-old child who was born in the US. She's married to a US citizen, but unfortunately, her US citizen husband has a criminal record, a felony. And so she can't apply through him, but even if she were able to, we're talking about 20 to 25 years wait. And she is legally authorized to work now because of DACA, but we don't know what's going to happen with DACA folks, kids who came here as children. We don't know what's going to happen with the Trump administration, the upcoming Trump administration. You might also have been following the discussion about H-1Bs. We can talk about that if you're interested. It's been a subject of discussion on the part of Elon Musk and Vivek. Is really, what's his last name? Swamy. Thank you. But that's a whole nother, that is a legal non-immigrant classification, and I can talk about it if you like. Anyway, next slide. If you have any questions, I would be glad to answer them. Yes, please.
How does an immigrant get a social security card?
Well,
Repeat the question.
how does an immigrant get a social security card? If the person is here legally as a non-immigrant, like they're in a classification where they can work, they can apply for a social security card. If they're not here legally, I suppose they could make up a number. You know, I mentioned the fact that there are all these people who are working, who have no authorization to work. Social Security is being deducted from their checks, but if the number doesn't jive, it goes into a special fund. And I suppose that there are some forgeries too for people who are undocumented. Yeah.
I know immigrants who have gotten undocumented,
Right.
who have gotten social security cards.
Yeah.
The thing to remember is as soon as you do that, you're paying taxes. So even they end up paying taxes.
Sure. Anyone who's working who has Social Security taxes deducted from their salaries, and they're paid.
It doesn't bother me a lot.
Is there a legal way for someone to do that? Or is that just forgery? You know? Is there a legal way for
There's no legal way
No.
for an undocumented person to get a Social Security card. Yes, sir.
My understanding is that you get a special number, you can get a special number, but it's not a social security card. Because I prepared taxes.
Yeah. I think you're talking about an ITIN number.
People who didn't have, they had this other number.
Right.
And it wouldn't match up.
Yeah, the question is, there's another number. I think it's called an ITIN number, and I've forgotten exactly what that. So, you know, you can have somebody in the US who is a dependent of somebody who is authorized to be here in a non-immigrant classification, like an L1 or an H1B, and they probably get ITIN numbers. They probably aren't able to get Social Security numbers. Other questions? Yes.
I was just kind of curious, so this extra money then, like, what happens to it? I mean, who's looking over this?
The question is, what happens to the extra money? It's sitting in a big fund with the US government somewhere, and
And could people take advantage of that? I mean, I just,
I don't think people can't take advantage of it, neither the foreign national nor the government, as far as that's concerned. It's just sitting there somewhere in a big box. Right, stays with the, right. Yes, sir.
There's the concept of sanctuary cities, which I think a lot of people in this room and this city would be interested in participating in. What are the risks to those of us who would like to help?
The question is, what is the risk that there is some interest in becoming a sanctuary city, and what is the risk? What I understand about sanctuary cities is that some cities have determined that they are not going to allow their police forces to assist with rounding up, undocumented individuals. I think the risk for individuals who are not, actively harboring a foreign national is probably minimal. But from what I've heard from the prospective Trump administration, there's an interest in the Trump administration on taking action against US cities that do that. And it would be economic action of some kind. Sure. Right, punishments such as not allowing federal funding to go to certain programs. Who knows? I guess we'll.
It forced, states to lower the speed limit to 55 back.
Yeah.
Do it, if you don't do it, we're going to take your highway.
Yeah.
They do the same thing, like
But that would require legislation, I think.
which, with a
Who knows what's going to happen? Yes,
I remember hearing that, before the Trump era, that there was concern about revamping our immigration policy because it was broken and it needed to be, repaired. But I'm wondering if there is a group that's working on that regardless of what Trump says, but people wanting to do something constructive, for immigration. Is there a group working on that?
the question is there a group working on making some constructive changes to the immigration situation? Well, I don't know specifically. However, any changes would have to be made by federal legislation.
That's true, but somebody should have a plan to propose.
There are lots of.
I'm sure there's lots of interest.
Creating plans, but you
Right.
can't just say Trump, because Democrats have been in total control of the government and have not updated the law either.
Well,
So it's Congress that has.
I mean, the current,
Thinking of,
sure.
people outside of government, regardless,
Oh, yeah, there are plenty of nonprofits that have created plans, but they haven't convinced Congress to pass them.
Even
whatever, who those,
I can look it up for you later.
Mark,
Cato Institute, to my understanding, is a conservative group.
yeah.
They're recommending some positive paths.
The Cato Institute has actually recommended legalization, looked at it purely from an economic point of view, but it's not going to happen without federal legislation. Question in the back.
One, this is a reference to groups here in Milwaukee who are working for improving rights of immigrants. A group here at First Church is joining the General Assembly of the Bolsa de la Frontera. That's January 25th. So a group of us are going to go to their General Assembly. It's at South Division High School. It's a day-long event. You can go to different sessions if you want. Hear about things that that group is doing to help improve immigrant rights and probably prepare for the Trump administration also. After that, that group is going to decide if we're going to continue immigrant right group here at First Church. So if you'd like to have information about that or be on a list of people to receive information, you can see me. And that's something, and I know Bolsa de la Frontera has initiatives that they're working on as far as driver licenses for immigrants, free lunches for students across Milwaukee is another initiative that they're working on. As someone who works in schools, I can tell you we're scared what's going to happen to our students. There had been an ICE policy before where schools were sanctuaries. That could change.
Yeah, ICE is Immigration Customs Enforcement.
I'll give you my email address. And I've got information about the group who's going to go to the Bolsa de la Frontera. Yeah.
Yeah. A question back here?
Yeah, about the driver's license thing. An illegal can get a driver's license, correct?
No. An undocumented alien cannot get a driver's license.
In Wisconsin or?
Well, it depends on the state, but
Depends on the state.
probably, I would say most, if not all states.
So if they made up an illegal driver's license,
Could be.
they could vote.
No, well, the question is, could someone make up an illegal driver's license and then vote? I think that the likelihood of someone even trying to do that, to use it to vote, is probably zero. Yeah.
So they already have your information when you vote, and so they cross-check that with your information on your license. So if it was with state ID, it wouldn't match up with the information that your city has on file.
I'm an election inspector in the city of Milwaukee. It's not exactly like that, but yeah, anybody can forge a document.
Sure.
And so could it be done? Yes, is a simple answer to that.
But does it happen often?
Well, we don't know exactly.
Well, I imagine voting illegally has consequences. I don't know what they are criminally. Sir,
Trump and Steven Miller and other people are talking about massive deportation. To what extent is this just a threat? To what extent are they gonna do anything? Can you please let us?
the question is, to what extent is mass deportation a reality, I guess? I think none of us know. I think there's going to be an effort, but we're talking about 10 to 11 million people, and US Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the border people are not staffed to be able to do that. I think I saw a statistic somewhere about, like maybe 400,000 people were deported during the Obama years. I don't know if those figures are correct, but it's a drop in the bucket. So do I think it's going to happen? I do. But to the extent that it will be done and who they will pursue first, that's anyone's guess.
The problem is that it creates an incredible, profound
Fear?
fear
Right.
in all the immigrants.
Yeah, yeah. I won't be offended if you need to leave. Question back here.
There's been a lot of talk about challenges for undocumented individuals like deportations like you were discussing, but for people who are on a legal citizenship, do they expect anything to slow down in terms of like getting citizenship once you're legal?
I have a hard time hearing your question.
So in terms of people who are here legally and are on the path to citizenship,
Yep.
do they expect any part of that process to slow down or to have challenges once you want to get citizenship?
I think that's something we just don't know, that whether or not when people are on the path to legal citizenship, whether that will slow. We don't know.
It's not something that's happened before that people have to use.
Well, I think that the process slowed during the pandemic, but that was more a problem with people being in the office and reviewing records and that sort of thing. They're just, your guess is as good as mine as to what shape the deportations plans are going to take place in the Trump administration. Yes.
2025 thing, they're talking about removing spouses of American citizens.
They're talking about, you're saying they're talking about removing spouses of American citizens? Yes. I mean, what I've heard is that a family will have a choice as to whether or not to leave, for instance, the US for Mexico if one of the spouses is undocumented and the other isn't. Who knows? So, yes.
The people who depend on the migrants for food production, I can't believe that there won't be a pushback because we're all going to be suffering.
The comment is that you think that there's going to be a pushback because of deportation of people who produce food. And I think that's true, and I think prices will actually go up. So, anyway, if you have any questions, be glad to answer.
You went through a whole page of lies, not your lies, but lies that are out there.
Sure.
Do you have any suggestions on how to counter that? Because once he says something, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's a fact.
Write to your legislators. What can you do? Anyway, thank you very much.